What is empiricism? Empiricism is the philosophical view that holds that true knowledge or justification comes only or primarily from sensory experience. In contrast to rationalism, it argues that the only knowledge one can have is a posteriori, and emphasizes the role of empirical evidence, rather than innate ideas, in the formation of ideas. The term empiricism comes from the ancient Greek empeiria, the Latin translation of which is experientia, from which we derive the English words experience and experiment. Empiricism is often seen as applied in the scientific method, which emphasizes observation, experimentation, and evidence. Indeed, it is a fundamental part of the scientific method that all hypotheses and theories must be tested against observations, rather than resting solely on a priori reasoning and intuition. Empiricism, a brief history. In the following section we will talk about the history of empiricism, from its roots in ancient philosophy to its elaborate presentation during the modern period. Ancient philosophy. The first empiricists in Western philosophy were the ancient Greek sophists. They rejected rationalist speculations about the world, and took humanity and society to be the proper objects of philosophy. Using skeptical arguments to undermine rationalist claims, they posed a challenge that helped shape Plato's rationalist thought. Although some consider Aristotle an empiricist, especially in contrast to Plato, he was in reality, though to a lesser extent, a rationalist. It was however his successors, the ancient Greek Stoics and Epicureans, who developed an explicitly empiricist account of the formation of mental concepts. For the Stoics, the mind is at birth a clean slate, which comes to be stocked with concepts by the sensory impingement of the material world upon it. This imagery and theory of the mind being a blank slate at birth is famously referred to as the tabula rasa theory, which is Latin for smooth or erased tablet. For the Epicureans, on the other hand, mental concepts are memory images, that is, the mental residues of previous sense experience, and knowledge is as empirical as the ideas that compose it. Medieval philosophy. Most medieval philosophers after St. Augustine took an empiricist position. They formulated their stand as, there is nothing in the intellect that was not previously in the senses. Thus St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, rejected innate ideas. He argued that both soul and body participate in perception, and all ideas are abstracted by the intellect from what is given to the senses. While ideas of unseen things are, according to him, derived by analogy from sense experience. The 13th century scientist Roger Bacon emphasized empirical knowledge of the natural world, and anticipated the Renaissance philosopher of science Francis Bacon, in preferring observation to deductive reasoning as a source of knowledge. The empiricism of the 14th century nominalist William of Ockham was more systematic. According to him, all knowledge of what exists in nature comes from the senses, while abstractive knowledge of necessary truths is merely hypothetical, and does not imply the existence of anything. Some of his followers extended his line of reasoning toward a radical empiricism, arguing that causation is not a rationally intelligible connection between events, but merely an observed regularity in their occurrence. Modern philosophy. In the earlier and unsystematic phases of Renaissance philosophy, Pierre Gassendi attempted to revive the empirical doctrines of Epicurus. But it was Francis Bacon who was the most important defender of empiricism during this early period. Although he did not deny the existence of a priori knowledge, he claimed that the only knowledge worth having is empirically based knowledge of the natural world. Such knowledge, he added, was to be pursued by the systematic arrangement of the findings of observation, and undertaken in the cooperative and impersonal style of modern scientific research. Bacon was the first to formulate the principles of scientific induction. A materialist and nominalist, Thomas Hobbes, combined an extreme empiricism about concepts, which for him were the product of material impacts on the bodily senses, with an extreme rationalism about knowledge, of which he considered geometry to be the paradigm. For him, all genuine knowledge is a priori, or the rigorous deduction from definitions. Yes, the senses provide ideas, but all knowledge comes from deductive calculations applied to the names that an individual has assigned to them. Yet all this knowledge is about material and sensible existences, since everything that can be known exists as a body. The most elaborate and influential presentation of empiricism was made by the early Enlightenment philosopher John Locke, in the first two books of his Essay Concerning Human Understanding. According to him, all knowledge comes from sensation or from reflection, by which he means the introspective awareness of the workings of one's own mind. In his book, he refuted innate knowledge and argued that infants know nothing. For if it were true that humans had innate knowledge, then no beliefs would be universal. Locke was also more consistent about the empirical character of all concepts. He described in detail the ways in which simple ideas can be combined to form complex ones, even those of what one has not yet experienced. George Berkeley, a theistic idealist and opponent of materialism, applied Locke's empiricism about concepts to refute the latter's account of human knowledge. Because he was convinced that in sense experience one is never aware of anything but what he called ideas, he concluded that physical objects are simply collections of perceived ideas, a position that ultimately leads to phenomenalism, the view that propositions about physical reality are reducible to propositions about actual and possible sensations. To account for the continuity and orderliness of the world, he supposed that its reality is upheld in the perceptions of an unsleeping God. The Scottish skeptical philosopher David Hume fully elaborated Locke's empiricism, and used it to argue that there can be no more to the concepts of body, mind, and causal connection, than what is found in the experiences from which they arise. Like Berkeley, he was convinced that in perceptions there are no elements that can exist independently of them. But unlike Berkeley, however, he could not find neither a notion of mind or self. As a result of his radical empiricism, his view of what exists was even more parsimonious. While Berkeley thought that only minds and their ideas exist, Hume thought that only perceptions exist, and that it is impossible to form an idea of anything that is neither a perception nor a complex of perceptions. The French philosopher Voltaire imported Locke's empiricism into France. There, it became the basis of sensationalism, a theory in which all the elements of human mental life are analyzed in terms of sensations alone. An original and clarifying attempt to resolve the controversy between empiricism and its opponents was made in the transcendental idealism of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant drew upon David Hume and the German rationalist Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. According to him, although all knowledge begins with experience, it does not all arise from experience. As such, he established a clear distinction between the innate and the a priori. He held that there are a priori concepts or categories, and substantial or synthetic a priori truths, which although are not derived from experience, apply to experience. A priori concepts and propositions, however, do not apply to realities that transcend experience. Rather, they reflect the mind's way of organizing the formless mass of sense impressions that flow in upon it. Lockean empiricism continued to flourish in 19th century England, until the rise of Hegelianism during the last quarter of the century. Perhaps one of the last empiricists during the modern period was the English philosopher John Stuart Mill. According to him, all knowledge worth having, including mathematics, is empirical. He argued that the apparent necessity and a prioricity of mathematics is merely the result of the unique massiveness of its empirical conformation. For Mill, all real knowledge is inductive and empirical, while deduction is sterile. Criticisms. Critics of empiricism argue that true knowledge, that is, universal and unchanging knowledge, cannot be acquired through the senses, since its object, the natural world, is particular and constantly changing. Other critics claim that empiricism is limited in its ability to explain certain types of knowledge and concepts, such as logic, mathematics, and causality, which are not based on sensory experience. Still other critics maintain that empiricism can lead to skepticism, as sense perceptions can be subjective and relative. Indeed, what one individual considers warm may be cool for another. If you like our content, please follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our channel for more videos. Thank you, and see you in our next one.